Hi, everyone. Welcome to Genealogy Adventures. I'm Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Donya Williams. How are you guys today? It's a dull but warm day today. Very, very warm.
Yeah, considering we're in November, the weather has been the temperature has been rather interesting, but we hope that thank you as always for spending the next hour with us, wherever you're watching or listening to us. And we have got quite the interesting topic for you today. So for a switch up, I'm going to actually be interviewing my lovely cousin and co-host Danya. I love the royal wave. About one of her Edgefield, South Carolina, Yeldell cousins. So if I remember correctly, you and John Yeldell, a.k.a. the Reverend Elijah Flemon, you share the same 3 times great-grandfather?
Yes, Henry. Henry
That's right.
Adams. Henry
Henry,
Adams.
that's the one. I was looking for the connection. And we thought this would be a really good, really interesting conversation to have and a really interesting interview to have because as, we are co-hosts and we're cousins, so Donnie and I speak on the phone quite often. And there were just a couple of really crazy kind of midterm election stories about voter suppression that was in the news. So there was a young lady in Georgia who had a valid photo ID, who was African American, who had her vote challenged, someone going out of the way to try to intimidate her. We've seen various news broadcasts of people with guns at polling places and at drop boxes. That's an image that will resonate with certainly African Americans of a certain age. Anyone who was alive during the civil rights era and before that, and we still have parents who are and grandparents. Um, that must be a sight. What would you think of that, Don? What would your mother make of this? Who was alive during the civil rights movement, who saw voter suppression in action before the federal government dealt with that? What would a person of her age group make of that? Seeing white people with guns at polling places.
I think as far as my mom, my family as a whole is very political. And so I think they kind of witnessed those things anyway. I have an uncle who was appointed to the very first DC council and he was on it until he retired and given an honorable, he is considered honorable. I've also have an uncle who was federally was in national politics to the point where there is a letter that was written to him from then politician John F. Kennedy asking him, once I win the presidential election, I would like to have you on the cabinet. But my uncle died before that could happen. So my family is very into politics, but I think it's kind of no. I think that they would see it as something that it was expected. I don't think they would be surprised or shocked behind it. I don't think that it would even bother them that much. Just enough for them to continue to be like, well, I'm fighting against it. So y'all, if y'all want to know why I'm rebel like, that's why. I'm a rebel because my family were rebels.
Indeed, and I'm even thinking about my dad's side in Virginia. Now that you said it that way, if that's the world that you grew up in and that's what you saw, then that's what you would expect. But I have to also think that, having had decades where that wasn't the practice, where you didn't see people with guns at polling stations, like this is some kind of remote country that's new to democracy, that's gotta hurt. And that's gotta
Yeah,
make you a little sad going, so we're back here again after all these
again.
decades. So the place we're talking about is going to be South Carolina. Specifically, the place we're going to be speaking of is Edgefield County, South Carolina. And we're just going to give a really brief overview of the progression of voter suppression that was happening that John would have been very much aware of. I mean, he was 19, I believe, when he
Hmm.
voted in, uh, was it 1884? He was 19 years old. So again, this is a history that wasn't just spoken about, he would have witnessed it, seen it, heard it discussed at the dinner table. So I'm going to start with 1865. That's when South Carolina goes in hard for what we can call the Black Codes, specifically in the Constitution, the state constitution. So things like there were codes designed to limit the rights and freedom of the formerly enslaved, who white supremacists in South Carolina didn't even recognize as being fellow citizens. They just didn't consider freed slaves citizens at all. State legislature actually refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, and I forgot about that until I was kind of doing the background on this one. I remember you telling me about that, and I think it's actually in Dawn has written a wonderful book called Comes to the Light. I didn't hide the title, and I centered
No,
it
you
to the
didn't.
camera, where the chapter, the person we're speaking about, John Yeldell, features, I think, 2 chapters in the book. So yeah, that's mentioned in here. That was a little bit of history that I relearned. So they didn't recognize the 14th Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, and from 1867 to 1876, did you know this as well? The U.S. Congress and the Army had to apply force to white South Carolinians in order to get them to acknowledge the civil rights of the formerly enslaved, of all Black people. By this point, 1867 to 76, we're talking about formerly enslaved, free people of color, everybody.
That was Reconstruction era.
But did you know that they had to intervene to that extent?
I am not surprised, because when I read about when I started to read about, ratifying that particular amendment and how the things that they had to go through to get that done, it's just not shocking to me that they had to do that. The South was really big on stopping people of color, whether they, regardless, they were very big on stopping that from happening and trying to push back into slavery. They were big on it. So I'm not shocked behind it. I'm not going to say that I knew it, but I don't want to say that I didn't know it. I just can't remember. But I do know that that particular thing is not a surprise. I can say that.
So before we start talking about John in 1876 and his experience with voting suppression and just the insanity that happened around in that year, just 2 quick things. So in 1868, we have the poll tax, which the state brought in. I guess in their desire to limit the Black vote, they didn't really think about poor white families who couldn't afford the poll tax, so obviously poor white people kicked off. So the poll tax was kind of put to the side. There was outright intimidation of Black people. There was violence. And as usual, this is Edgefield, and it's also South Carolina. So there was murder as well to, again, intimidate people to stop them from voting. 1870, again, they tried adjusting the number of acres. Again, it's going back to a property owning basis to be able to vote, and they were rejigging the number of acres that someone had to own in order to vote. That got called unconstitutional, so that got kicked out. Now we come to 1876, and we're going to start speaking about John properly. So like 1870, in 1868, we have all out just intimidation, violence. This is the period of the Hamburg, Ellerton, and Cainhoy. I'm going to call them massacres. Sometimes they're called riots, sometimes it's called unrest, but it's the Hamburg, Ellerton, and Cainhoy massacres. And again, all rooted in voted suppression. So talk a little bit about John's experience about the 1876 election, which oddly enough also involved Garfield running for president.
Right. So the thing about John is that when he was 19 years old, he was always, and like I said before, my family has always been political. And the thing about John is that when he was 19 years old, he was a part of dealing with the Garfield administration, trying to get votes in and things of that nature. And as stated in my book, there's an area where he kind of tells his own story, and he talks you He tells you about this particular portion of his story so that he can let you know what we're here to really talk about. But he says, on the day of Garfield's election, I was about 19 years of age, and although not a voter myself, I controlled 165 votes. As we came near the voting place, the rear guard of our men was attacked by well known Southerners with clubs and stones. I told my men to stand firm. Mr. Lyons, you'll hear his name later, drove up, and I caught his horse by the bridle, asking him what he wanted. He wanted the Negroes to go from the polls. This was just one of the times that they had to fight to vote. And even though it's not necessarily to that extreme today, it's still that type of suppression where people have to go and they have to, they have to make themselves, they have to be able to prove that they should be able to vote. And that's what this story was going towards.
Because I mean, there's just a couple of things that are kind of floating around in my head. So people are going to say, well, the violence isn't the same or the tactics of intimidation aren't the same, and it doesn't matter. It's the intention and it's the energy behind it. There was no reason for Lyons to even be there to begin with. It was a bunch of black men with vote, because again, you have to remember, this isn't a city. This isn't a large town. This is a very rural area. And I guess the way that it worked was, they had a lockbox, people put their votes in, and John and his company, as registered Republicans, they took those votes to the polling place. There was no violence. No one was brandishing guns. There wasn't raucous or anything. They were executing, as far as what you're saying, their civic duty. So why do you think Parks even felt that he needed to be there?
But here's the thing, to go back. If it's not the same, then why now today there are some people that stand around with guns toting around the ballot box, making sure you putting in, they're like that today. So the intimidation actually is still the same. All of that, the intensity of it is somewhat still the same. What makes it different is that now we are the legality of it is what makes it different, and that the states are now following through on the legality. Back then, even though it was legal for Black people to vote, they were against it in their own right. So they didn't really follow through or follow suit on it. But Parks is really more for the
Oh, sorry, not Parks. It was Lyons. Why did Lyons feel as though he needed to insert himself? Apart from the only reason that I can think of, he wanted to assert his authority as a deputy, as a lawman, even though there was nothing illegal going on. There wasn't even a whiff of anything illegal going on. Everyone was conducting themselves the way they ought to have. And the minute he injected himself, things went south, things went sour. So what happened next? Because it's Edgefield, it's guns and there's bullets. So what happened next?
So after that, like I said, he said he wanted the Negroes to go from the polls. John refused, and inside of 4 weeks was forced to leave the state. So John was made to leave. That's what happened next. And because he was a part of giving all of us the right to vote. So when you guys, those that are on my page, and you hear me saying things like you should vote, this is where I get it from. This is where it comes from. This is why it's so very, very important for you to do your research so you can understand who you are. I want our fans to understand and know Brian is the one that is out there with the research. I don't want y'all to think that I don't. I do, but I'm so very focused on trying to get my family to know and learn about who we are and where we came from that I don't research to the extent that Brian does. But there are things that I point out to people all the time. Like today, I pointed out about our lines disappearing and things of that nature. So don't think that I don't know.
Well, I would categorize it as your interest and your enthusiasm is based in, I would call, community level research. So you get your passion and your fire telling the story of Edgefield and telling the story of Edgefieldians, where I guess because I started my research in Virginia, then went into South Carolina, and now working on kind of like researching entire communities of people, mine is more kind of broader in scope.
Right. And it's not that I don't do the kind of research that you do, because
Mm,
sometimes when you have a question about something, you are like, hey, I need to run this by you, and let's see where we go. And and we've always bounced off of each other like
yep.
that. So
And I
I
know if
do
there's
want
any
you, go ahead.
and I know if there's any new info to come out of Edgefield, that's the other reason why I don't feel I have to really research it so intensively. I know you just have it covered. I just know if there's anything wild or that I need to know, that my cousin's gonna keep me in the loop.
Oh yeah, I need to tell you something too.
I know you do.
I do. I just found out something the day before the show started. But as far as John is concerned, he was kicked out. He was kicked out of the state. And
And he was out for
when
2 weeks. Was it 2 or 3 weeks?
according to his story, he was actually no, he was banished for 2 years.
2 years. Oh, that's right.
Yeah, he said after 2 years of banishment, I returned to South Carolina to a place called the Dark Corner. Now, if you guys are Edgefield readers, learning about Edgefield, there is another book that was written. And now I cannot think of the name of Nathan and Gail's book for anything, but
Isn't it
I
the many
will get
stories
it.
of Edgefield?
No,
No. Okay,
no, no. There's something about Edgefield. That's
that's
what it's
it.
called. There is something about Edgefield. And that book was written by another set of family members of ours and other genealogists that we worked with, named Nathan Kemp and the late Edna Gale Bush. Nathan actually wrote about the Dark Corner. And the Dark Corner was a really, really bad place. I mean, Edgefield in itself was very racist, but Dark Corner, they were determined that no Black people would be a part of that area. So this is where he, returned to. He returned to a place called the Dark Corner. He said, "This is the place where it was stated that I pushed ladies off the sidewalk. 4 men and 3 children compose the city so that the absurdity of the story appears on its face. I went back to my old home because I wanted to talk for Blaine. And for 18 months, I stayed. And in that time, I carried on a Blaine campaign. And the Democrats knew nothing of that fact. During the day, I'd run the engine, pick cotton, and hold corn. And they knew no more of me. One day, I was walking down the road when John Parks rode up to me and asked me what the shooting in the woods the night before meant. I told him I didn't know. And he, with the crowd at his back, demanded that I be searched for a pistol. So we're going into the story of John and
Mhm.
how what actually happened with him. He says that they didn't know him, but they knew him.
Now, you just said something that I didn't register the first time or the second time that I'd read it. So he was being accused of pushing white ladies off the sidewalk. And if anyone is in any doubt that that wasn't true or that that couldn't have been true, I'm going to answer the question that I would have asked you. If he had really done that, he'd be dead.
On the
If he,
spot.
if any black man who touched a white woman in public, much less pushed her off the sidewalk, I mean, that's assault for starters. He'd be
Yeah.
dead.
And
There wouldn't have even been a trial.
it would have been a lynching right there on the street.
There would have been.
Right there. Given the time period that we're talking about, given the area that we're talking about, it would have been a lynching. And he actually came off and explained that it was really not that many people that lived in that town anyway. He was very, very bold. He was a very bold speaking man. He did not,
Mhm.
he wasn't afraid of anything. So he was like, it was only 4 men and 3 children that composed the whole area. So, and they're gonna tell me I push ladies off the street. This is the tone of his story. And I want y'all to know this as well about him. This entire story that Brian and I are talking about was found in the papers. The entire
All of
story.
that. Much of it reproduced in Danya's book.
Yes, yes. It was written so well that I put a lot back in the book just so you could see it verbatim, the words that was being said, not just by Black people, but also by white journalists not just by Black journalists, but also by white journalists who they saw it and they were like, you had some that were like, this is atrocious. This doesn't make any sense. You had some that was to his side, and then you had others that was going the other direction. This story was so popular that it read from east to west coast. There was not one paper that didn't have some inkling of this story in it. So
But
this was a very powerful story.
so what springs to mind, and again, this is going to color kind of John's story in the second half of the show, is that this is what I call the white supremacist's playbook. And you'd actually, I'm going to take that back. You don't even have to, you just have to be seeped in a culture of white supremacy. You don't have to be a supremacist yourself. You don't even have to necessarily believe it, but subconsciously, it's the playbook that's very effective. So he gets accused of one of the most egregious things that a Black man in the South, in South Carolina, in Edgefield specifically, could possibly do. We're all, all the accusations that are hurled at us are always other, just way beyond the realms of normalcy, where I don't see any other group of people who get attacked like that. You think about Obama. He wasn't American. He wasn't born in this country. He's not American. Even if he was a Muslim, it wouldn't matter. But all of those things that were attached to him. Look at what Kamala Harris had to go through.
Exactly.
When she was running for vice president. So, and what I can't think of the lady's name in Georgia who's running for governor. Stacey Abrams. It's the same playbook.
It's
all the time.
Same playbook. It is.
So he'd been tarred by this already.
Right.
So now we're coming up to 1884.
Right.
So he's already lived through all of this insanity in 1876. Right. Now we're at 1884.
Right. So what happens in 1884 is this particular Parks guy who came up on him and have him to be searched. They basically was trying to blame him for a shooting that happened. First, the women being pushed off the sidewalk and a shooting happening, and they attacking people, him, and they tried to say it was him and a group of other men. And basically, John, he stood up to him. He had no problem standing up to him. At one point, he asked him, when he asked about the pistol, he told him to search for the pistol. I asked him what right had he to investigate such matters. And he said, but no, I showed the pistol to him and his friends and dared them to take it. This is my favorite.
See, now this is what I have a question about, because the research that you did on this was impeccable and was just awesome. And you read through, I'm not exaggerating, there were hundreds of newspapers. If you go in newspapers.com and type in John Yeldell and the year range, like 1870 to 1900, you're going to mostly get this story, the 1884 story. And it was like the CNN of its day. Not even that. It was like it was the national news story of the day. It was reproduced literally from coast to coast, east to west, north to south. I was even amazed. Little teeny tiny newspapers in like Missouri and Arkansas were like covering the story.
Yeah.
So
it is why he was actually noted as the most talked of colored man in the land. They ended because it was so widely talked about.
So because I guess I'm assuming this was coming off of a newswire and it wasn't being reproduced verbatim. So then all of a sudden I'm going to assume that all of the variations in the story must have been really kind of difficult because there was only one truth ultimately. So I wasn't clear where this altercation took place. Apparently there was a store, there was an African-American man in the store who wanted to vote, who was a registered Democrat. John and his crew were Republicans. Again, remember, this was a highly contentious, yet another highly contentious election after the Civil War. What is the correct genesis of the story? Was there another man was it in the store? Was there another man?
The story is really he was actually doing some work for Blaine at the time, the new person that was running, and he was in John Parks's store and when it happened. And John Parks didn't like that he was working for, and oh, we didn't say this. You have Democrats and Republicans. Although it's the same names, they're not the same party. So
Mhm.
this is he was actually working for the Republicans because these were the people of Lincoln. This was the party of Lincoln at that time. Whereas the Democrats were people like Strom Thurmond, everybody who was against or whatever, against was for slavery. So he was all for the Republicans and working for them. John Parks was a Democrat and did not like the fact that John Yeldell was in there working for Blaine to try to get votes, garner votes for him. And that's what caused the entire situation. However, there were 3 articles. One was stating that John had started something. The other was stating that although John did start something, he didn't go to that extreme the way Parks tried to make it to be. And the other was the actual story of what happened. But all 3 of these stories were placed in the newspapers.
Mhm. And the characterization of John, most of them made him sound like he was a scoundrel, that he was uncouth,
Yes,
that he was,
yes,
and I guess using a British slang, I don't know if there's an American equivalent, that he was dragged up and not brought up. But there was one outlier. I think it was a Mississippi or a Georgia article that actually, it was, first of all, it had lots of wrong names, but then it described him as being a very kind of educated, well presented Negro.
yeah, yeah.
But that was the only one that portrayed
There was
him
only
that way.
one. Yeah, yeah. You didn't have that a lot. And it wasn't a Mississippi article, it was a Northern article. You could
Okay.
actually tell the difference between the Southern articles and the Northern articles. The Northern articles were in support of him, whereas the Southern articles were against him. And it was so crazy because that's why I remember I put in the book an article about a man who kind of did the same exact thing to a group of people, and they were like, oh, he was going through this and this is why this happened, and hopefully the judge will be lenient on him and blah blah blah. John turns around and they're like, yeah, string him up. That was it was 2 of the same type of incidents, but because he was black he was going to be strung up, and because he was white, the other guy was white. Oh, he's going through some things. Does that not sound familiar today? These are the
Mhm.
same things that are happening today. This is why we're talking about this particular story, because it
And
hasn't changed.
it is also a cautionary tale of why guns and voting don't go together. So who got shot and how did he get shot?
Okay, so basically what happened after the little altercation with Mr. Parks and John Yeldell, Mr. Parks got a little upset. And so Parks was an actual judge, and he gathered a posse. And with that posse, he wanted that posse to go get John Yeldell and his friends because they were causing ruckus. Long story
And
short,
just
go
just
ahead.
just define what was the ruckus. What did they classify as the ruckus?
That was the pushing of the ladies off the sidewalk, and him doing the voting in his store. That was
But
the ruckus.
but all he was doing was canvassing.
Oh, okay. That was the ruckus.
I just wanted to get that straight. Okay.
That was the ruckus. That was the ruckus. He was canvassing, basically. So this posse got together and they went to go after John and them. Now, even though it doesn't say it in the articles, you tend to realize that John and them found out that they were coming after them. So they kind of huddled at this particular place. And one thing led to another, and that is what began the Parksville riot. The Parksville riot was held in 1884 in the Dark Corner. Um,
Although I'm going to call that a massacre too. And can you explain why Parksville is the one that South Carolina as a state just does not want to talk about?
because they lost this case. That's the bottom line. This turned into a huge um trial. And the reason why, but it turned into this huge trial. But they first had to get the people, and men were killed. There were black men that were killed, but there was one white guy who was actually the son of another white man who was shot. And as they were going after these black men, John was the one black man that got away. And when I say he got away, guys, I'm talking about John disappeared for 5 years. He left. He got out of town. And when he got out of town, I mean, at one point for a year, he hid in South Carolina in plain sight without them knowing. It wasn't in Edgefield, but he was in South Carolina. When he got that little tingling feeling in his spine, he ended up going to Pennsylvania, and he went to church. He went to school, and he became a minister. And he literally made a move as if he was on the Underground Railroad, and he ended up changing his name, and his name was now Reverend Elijah Flemon, and no one knew who he was. And then one day, he was on the pulpit and he was preaching, and while he was on that pulpit preaching, there was a man sitting in the audience and looking at him and looking at a piece of paper, looking at him, looking at a piece of paper. When he came off of that pulpit, he was arrested as being John Yeldell. No one knew how they found out. Well, we ended up finding out how they found out. 5 years, guys. This happened. The original incident happened in 1884. So 5 years went past, and it was 1889. Those people were harassing his family for 5 years to try and find him. And they finally found him because of a letter that he wrote to a sibling just to let them know that he was okay. This is how he got found. And they wanted the sheriff in Pennsylvania to hold him until they got there so they can get him, extradite him back because he committed this crime and killed this man. Well, that's where everything just went crazy. And it became a huge political fight, both through that involved senators, almost involved the president at that time.
Governors.
It definitely involved both the governors of South Carolina and the governor of Pennsylvania. He was literally for about 2 months. The New York Times has him listed as the most talked of colored man in the land. That was the name of the title of their story, and then dubbed him as popular as Frederick Douglass. One of the stories read like a movie. When I tell y'all, I was sitting down like eating popcorn reading this. That's what I was doing because it was amazing. It was an amazing story.
And the genesis of it, just to cycle back to underline it again, was him causing a ruckus. Apparently laying hands on white women and pushing them on the sidewalk, which we just know, as I said, Camp Hate just couldn't be true because he would have never survived. He wouldn't have survived that. And canvassing.
Yeah.
So why would you need to raise a posse? Now that's an important word. A posse is not just 2 or 3 dudes. That's a lot of men with a lot of guns.
A lot of men with a lot of guns, yes.
Why would you feel the need to raise an entire posse for one African-American man who was canvassing?
Because they knew him. That's why. They knew him from before. Because one of the sheriffs that came and got him in Pennsylvania, when they came to get him in Pennsylvania, was Mr. Lyons. He was one of the ones. That's the same person that he dealt with earlier when he was doing it for Garfield. So they knew him. They knew who he was. They felt him as a troublemaker, and they needed to get rid of him.
And Edgefieldians were pretty good at running people out of town.
Oh, yeah. We have several family members that were ran out of town. I mean, I honestly believe that my grandfather was.
Mm. But who was you would think I would know this name. I want to say it's Harrison. That's why I'm asking rather than saying, who was the white politician that got run out of Edgefield County in the 1800s? Who was a Republican? Talbert. That was it. Who was also a Republican.
Yeah. It was a Talbert, and that caused the Phoenix riot. That was and how we lost several of our family members in that. That was they now call that a massacre. But originally that was also called the Phoenix Riot. And they went and they just killed people like and left them on the street. One woman died just like Breonna Taylor died. I mean,
Hmm.
this is there's no change.
I just think that if it weren't for white supremacy, if John could have just been seen as a young man who was really interested, who was very passionate about his politics, just a different politics than the majority of the town, that's Lyons could have taken to one side to say, listen, John, you're from Edgefield. You know this isn't how we do things around here. Or if you're going to do this, don't go in Parks' store because you know what Parks is like. That's not how they chose to deal with it.
Well, I often wondered why he went into Parks' store. I know we rebels, but did he really want to start something, or was it somewhat of a setup? Because
I didn't think. That's a good.
you know,
That's a good question.
yeah. I mean, and that's something that I have not been able to find in research, but to want to for him to go in that store when everybody knows what the dark corner was. They knew what the dark corner was from the very beginning. It didn't wait. It didn't come years later. That was an area where they just didn't want Black people to be. Why in the world would you send him in a store like that when Black people don't go there anyway?
And he would have had a good, even if he didn't know Mr. Parks intimately or very well. He knew Mr. Parks, or he
Yeah,
knew kind of the authority that Park. Well, he was a judge. He knew the
he was
authority
a
that Parks
judge.
had.
Exactly. Exactly. So why do it there? Why have that? I've never understood that. But Edgefield, they always got stuff that you just don't understand. And one day it comes to you, or it just may not. But this right here, I don't think it'll ever really I don't think we'll ever really know.
Hmm. I'm just thinking of so many different ways that it could have played out. It's like listen, this time it's a warning. Next time you're going to cool your heels in jail. There were just so many different ways rather than just jump to posse. I guess that's
Well, the thing about we got to think about excuse me, the area that we're talking about. Edgefield wasn't the area that would. I'm sorry, y'all. My chair is falling. um, Edgefield isn't the area that gives warnings. You and if they did give the warning, it's not that kind of warning. If anything, the warning is said, "Hey, we'll be back," and so just be ready for us when we come back. They already telling you when we come back, we doing whatever it is that we want to do, whether it's raping your children, your wives, whether it's no matter. I mean, we've had people who've left town because they came to the house, told the women, "Oh, let your husband know that when we come back, we're raping you and your children, your daughters." And he can't do nothing about it. And these men is packing up their stuff and getting up out of town before they come back. This is the area that Edgefield was. So a warning would have been, if you're not gone in 2 seconds, I'm gonna shoot you where you stand. That's what that was. A warning. And let me be clear. It's not just a warning from a white person to a Black person. This is it didn't matter. Take Preston Brooks, not Preston Brooks, Thomas Byrd and Wickfall. Thomas Byrd told him, if you don't take that note down off of the courthouse door about my grandfather, I'm gonna shoot you where you stand. What was Wickfall's response? Shoot and go both ways. This was some from white man to white man. So it really just didn't matter how. A warning to them was nothing. It was instant. Warnings were instant. There was no such thing.
again just there's just so many parts to this story that's some of it we'll never know, but the bits that we do, it's just crazy.
Right. And then
That's,
so when we go into what happened afterwards, there was a trial that was started. There was a big thing from the very beginning, from the moment they found him on the pulpit up to the trial. They had to fight to get him there for extradition. And this is why the title of this particular show is what it is. the man who put South Carolina on trial, because South Carolina first lied and said that the incident happened. They did two lies. They said that it was in 85, and then said it was in 86. Well, they made those lies up like that because they didn't want the statute of limitations to go away. They wanted to make sure they could get them. So that was one of the things they did. Then once they went through all of the steps to try to get him extradited to Edgefield, once they finally won that, and they had to win that because senators, congressmen, people were involved in it. Once they finally won that, they had to promise, South Carolina had to promise that he would make it there safely, because he told them, if y'all let me go with these two men, I will not make it to the train station. So it caused the whole issue.
Was it the Pennsylvania governor who was the chief one that was basically saying he wouldn't get a fair trial?
No, originally it was John that said he wouldn't get a fair trial, but as things went on, yes, that governor, he was like, you have to promise me that he will get a fair trial, and that if he is found not guilty, that you will make sure that he makes it to and from, because if he want to come back here, he can come back here. So they had to do that. And what started South Carolina being on trial was when the governor of South Carolina, Richardson, responded. His response to that particular governor was, oh, he will be safe. We always follow the rules. This is South Carolina in the 1800s, in the 1880s, not a good 25 years from the Civil War. This is South Carolina, the place that fired the first shot in the Civil War. And you're going to come out and say that. This made the white journalists go crazy. They went off. They were like, no, he didn't just say that they follow the rules. And they brought every little thing about South Carolina that they have done wrong since the Civil War had ended, from the Reconstruction era on through. They brought it all up. And now South Carolina was placed on trial because of that one statement. And they had to get him there. And he had armed guards. He had armed guards coming to South Carolina. He had armed guards the whole time he was there. I'm telling you, the story is amazing.
So he was acquitted at the end.
Yeah. That's what makes it amazing, because he won.
What happened next?
So after he won, when the verdict was read, the trial itself got so bad that he didn't even have to stand up for himself. He didn't open his mouth. There was no going back and forth between the district.
So he wasn't put on the witness stand?
No, he was not put on the witness stand, and his attorneys did not question anybody. They sat there. They let it happen.
So is that kind of like a protest? I'm here because I have to be, but that's all you're going to get.
I don't think it was a protest. I think that South Carolina began to hang itself. The things that they were doing, the stuff that they were saying, they didn't have to do anything.
Because I've just never heard of a trial where not only did the defendant not say anything, but their defense attorney or attorneys didn't say anything. Okay.
They didn't say anything. Nothing was done. And they just sat there, and they let that whole thing happen. And when the verdict was read, first off, he couldn't be in the room, because the father to the young man that was killed, he said, if this verdict comes back guilty, I'm going to shoot him where he's standing. So he had to be in the jailhouse with a guard around him.
So not the person who made the threat.
No, John.
The person who was literally having their day in court. Okay.
Yeah. He had exactly. He had to be protected. He was completely protected with armed guards all around him. And the verdict came back. And when the verdict came back not guilty. He was found not guilty, and he won. Once he won, they had to get him out of town, and they had to get him out of town as quickly as possible. and he had this armed guard of, and it was lined on a train where he went back to Pennsylvania. And when he went back to Pennsylvania, you guys, he never went by the name John Yeldell again. His own family did not know that he was actually John Yeldell.
Now,
That's what's amazing.
because we know again, vengeance, not an unfamiliar concept in that part of South Carolina, but that part of South Carolina, vengeance is not unknown. Do you think that John may have spent the rest, because the cat was out of the bag? Both names were appearing together in newspaper articles. Elijah Fleming, a.k.a. John Yeldell, a.k.a. the Reverend Elijah Fleming. The cat was out of the
Mhm.
bag. Do you ever get the sense that he spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering what crazy person is going to be coming up from Edgefield to have a go?
Nope, I don't. And I may feel like that because it's my family and we not scared. I mean I really can honestly sit here and say that my family is never afraid. So if you're gonna do something, you're gonna go ahead and do it and stop playing games, or you just not. And I don't feel like he was afraid. I also, what I do think is that he definitely made sure that no one called him John Yeldell again, that he never went by that name again. And he covered his tracks so well that when he wrote his accounts of what happened, he never mentioned his parents' names. He never
Mm-mm.
mentioned his siblings' names. He never mentioned where his what plantation his family grew up on. He gave no indication of anything that would direct you to to his family. He stopped it. And I feel like that it's like that because of how he was found. He was found because all he did was wrote a letter to say, hi, I'm, to let you know how I was doing. And now all of this. Now, let me give y'all another thing. My family is probably the most secretive people in the world, black and white. They are very, very secretive.
I joke about it with you all the time. I say if the American government ever needs to have people teach witness protection program and like just completely dropping off the face of the planet, get a Yeldell.
Get a
Get a
Yeldell.
Yeldell.
Get a Yeldell because they can do it. White and black, they had no problem. Loretta just said, and you wonder why the Yeldells are elusive. I actually don't wonder why. I think this whole situation has everything to do with why they became so elusive. I really do. With the one white Yeldell who was like, you know what? When the Civil War began, he was like, I don't want no parts of it. You take my people, I'm out. And he just left the people that he had enslaved to his brother, and he left never to return. He didn't have anything else to do with it. That was it. To this kind of stuff. You guys, my family has at least seven different surnames that they go under, that we found them under. One minute they were Yeldells, next minute they were this other name of people. And you don't see when it changes. You don't see who it changes. You don't see
Hmm.
why it changes, any of those things. I really and honestly believe that this story has everything to do with that. They disappeared. And they would disappear for 2 and 3 censuses at a time. And then all of a sudden pop up as a whole nother name. This is why I got so upset about Shepard Yeldell or Shepard Harrison, excuse me, and how he turned around and said at 104 years old, oh yeah, my father's name is James Yeldell. I just changed my last name to Harrison when we moved to the Harrison Yeldell plantation. Number one, ain't no Harrison Yeldell plantation. Because we'd have been all through that area, and absolutely no one knows who that is, where that is, what that is. And number two, this man has 16 children. If he has 16 children and all of them are carrying the last name Harrison, but their bloodline is Yeldell, how do you find your family? This is my
Unless
issue with
unless you
it.
stumble across a really good DNA match, a couple of DNA matches, or find that article.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
But they
So
even but the Yellow family even goes to the extreme where we don't even see them living near one another after a certain point. After about
Yeah,
1860, you don't see them living, black or white. You do not see
black
them
or white.
living near each other. It's
My
almost like this
grandfather
type.
lived next to he lived next to his brother. But when his brother died, but I think he lived next to his brother because his mother was living with him. I honestly believe that. And when his brother died, he left and came to DC. That was it. His sister was still alive. He was, um, I don't know. I don't know. But what I do know is the story of John Yeldell, aka Reverend Elijah Flemon, is one
Mhm.
for the theaters.
And I wonder why his story hasn't been taken up by, African American heritage organizations and societies and people like the NAACP and civil rights groups. Is it because he had that murder kind of charge association? I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
To be honest, my thoughts is because they couldn't find him. They didn't know. See, if you didn't, the one of the things about this particular research, you had John Yeldell appearing 1870, 1880, and then disappearing. And then you had Reverend Elijah Fleming pop up out of the
Because you
blue.
had to do that. You had to make sure that there was no
I
period where
had to
both
make
of those
sure.
names were being used at the same time.
Exactly. So because it was because of that, you had to be sure that these were the same two people. And if they're not into doing that kind of research, then they're not gonna pull it. But I also think it's because they don't get mad at me, y'all, but y'all know how I am. They talk a good game, but they don't follow suit or follow through. We have so many stories. I'm not the only person with the John Yeldell story. We have so many stories out there where our family members have done some absolutely courageous things, and no one talks about it. No one hears about it. No one knows about it. And you have all these Black genealogists out here that are trying to share these stories, that are trying to let everybody know. And you have all these Black producers and companies, or even white producers and companies that won't look at us. They continue to go the
Mhm.
other direction. We're
And
here.
I'm in the closing minutes of the show. I'm going to say that's very topical because on Genealogy Adventures on our Facebook timeline, there is a project that is looking for Black writers about Black history. So it's perfect for family historians, genealogists, as Donnie was saying. If you've got a really amazing, they don't necessarily have to be amazing, but just a really interesting story. Check it out. It's right there on our Genealogy Adventures Facebook feed. And Nika Sewell Smith actually posted something on Twitter today saying, really encouraging African Americans tell your family stories. They don't need to be towering people. They don't need to have been wealthy. Just tell their stories.
Yes. Because their stories are pertinent to history. One thing couldn't happen without the other. I mean, when we talk about my book and we talked about Martha Brooks in the book, she saw things that nobody would have seen. She was probably the mate. She was enslaved by the son of South Carolina, Preston Brooks. So she knows about the lynch. She knows about the caning. She knows why he did it. She knows she overheard him talking about it. Everything, all of that. These are the things that our stories, they matter. This is why they matter, because they tell that part that's missing. So yeah, Brian, you were right. I'm more of a community type thing, and just trying to get people to really understand where they come from. But I do what Brian does.
You do,
I do.
absolutely.
I do it. I do it.
So, do we have enough time for you to talk about next week's show?
Sure. Next week's show is with Miss Bernice Bennett about Black homesteaders. Again, we're going to go back on that. But last time we were in the Midwest. Now we're going to
Mhm.
be in the South. And we're going to talk about Black homesteading in the South and her book, Black Homesteaders of the South. But yeah, we're going to talk with Bernice Bennett. It's going to be, she's a regular on our show as well. So she, she's one for the books, one of my mentors. And I look forward to having her on the show again to talk about it.
Same here. Always learn something new when we have Bernice on the show. So, in
Yeah.
the last minute, give a shout out to John. If there's one thing that you wanted people to know
Uh,
about John, what is it?
what would it be?
Hmm.
Continue to fight. Continue to fight for your rights, because that's what he did. That's what he did. He fought. He and won. I need that part to really resonate with all of the listeners out here. He won. His story did not end in a tragedy. His story did not end in him hanging. Matter of fact, guys, his story ended with him having about 8 kids and grandchildren and photos of him with his being surrounded by his children. His story ended beautifully. So it's not always a tragedy. That's what I
Because
want
again,
people to know.
I know everyone is passionate about voting and everyone thinks that it's important, but to Black people, to African Americans specifically, and I don't care if you descend from free people of color who also weren't considered citizens or enslaved people, that our ability to vote was the promise that our ancestors dreamt of for generations.
That's right.
And for
It's life
anyone,
saving.
and for anyone to try to pervert that, subvert it, take it away, diminish it, or suppress it, it's a bad thing.
It's a bad thing. It's a life saving thing for us. So, we need this. So I thank you guys for listening. And if you are interested, my book can be purchased off of Amazon.com. It's called Comes to the Light. There we go. It's called Comes to the Light. And I have no problem in going in and I'll answer some of the questions that were put in the chat. We didn't get to.
Okay. Well, as always, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. As we said, next week is going to be Bernice Bennett, which we're really looking forward to. And you will find us right here, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And until then, I'm Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Donya Williams. Have a glorious rest of the day.
Indeed. Take care.